We continue tonight with our series of studies about small things, and tonight I suppose we could classify it as being small people. I suppose the Bible student is familiar with the classification of people called centurions. They're New Testament characters. The centurions were not really dominant, prominent people throughout the Bible, were they? They were not like Abraham and Isaac and Jacob and Moses and Joshua and all down through the list. But yet we shall see that even though they were relatively insignificant in the overall scheme of things, they emphasize to us the point that we're trying to make in these classes, that there's really no such thing as an unimportant person, and the things that we do are important, and they matter not only to us, but matter to the cause of Christ, and they matter to people round about us. The centurions, they were Roman soldiers. They were called centurion because they had the command of over 100 men. You see the term centurion, century, 100, you see it all ties together there. And they had some significant things to do, but they were not the most prominent in the things in which they were involved. They were Gentiles. They were not in their homeland. They were in the land of Palestine among the Jews. They were not a group of people that generally would be accepted by the general population, because the Jewish people had a great antagonism and almost hatred for the Roman authorities that ruled over them, didn't they? And the Jewish people have always been ferociously independent when they were able to provide for that. And so these centurions, these soldiers that were there, they were there as what we would call occupation troops, weren't they? They were there by the instigation and the authority of the emperor to keep order and to make sure that the people in the land obeyed his voice. I doubt that anybody that studies the Bible very much would really classify them as being a prominent people. But I want to suggest to you, dear folks, that they were very necessary in the continual flow of things as we read in the New Testament. They were very significant in the life of our Lord while he was here upon this earth. They were significant in the life of the Apostle Peter. And we read about them more in affairs that has to do with the Apostle Paul. But now we want to turn to the passages. There are only, I think, about 9 different passages that mention the centurions, sometimes in the plural, more often than not in the singular. And we read, first of all, and I'm going to take them as they come in the New Testament. I think that's a logical way to study them. Turn to Matthew chapter 8. This is our first encounter with the centurion. Matthew 8, and beginning with verse 5. And when Jesus was entered into Capernaum, there came unto him a centurion, beseeching him. Now this word beseech is a humble petition. He's not making any demands on the Lord. He's not trying to command him in any way. He is not trying to exercise authority over the Lord. He is coming with a very humble request and saying, Lord, my servant lieth at home sick of a palsy, grievously tormented. Now the account of this particular event is also found in Luke the 7th chapter. And in Luke the 7th chapter it tells us that he He dearly loved this servant. He really respected this servant. This servant meant something more to him than just the service that would be rendered. And so this servant is in a bad way. So we see the centurion, obviously, though he has command over him, he has a sympathy for him. He has an interest in his fellow human being, even though they were in different roles of life, one an officer and the other a servant. Why, he still looked upon him as a human being and one that was favored to him. And Jesus saith unto him, I will come and heal him. Now the man has not asked anything yet, as far as we can tell from this record. But Jesus obviously knew why he had come and what his request was. And the centurion makes an explanation. The centurion answered and said, Lord, I am not worthy that thou shouldest come under my roof, but speak the word only, and my servant shall be healed. For I am a man under authority, having soldiers under me, and I say to this man, Go, and he goeth, and to another, Come, and he cometh, and to my servant, Do this, and he doeth it. Now, this man is showing his respect for the power of Christ. Lord, all you've got to do is just speak it. You've got the authority, you've got the ability, you've got the power, and I'm not even deserving that you come under the roof of my house. Can't we see how this centurion admired the Christ? How he appreciated his power and how he had faith in his ability? And he had a humble spirit about him too, didn't he? He said, Lord, I know what authority is. I have authority. I can exercise authority. I can tell this one to do this, and he'll do it, and tell that one to do that, and he'll do it. I know what that is, and you've got the authority. You don't have to come to my house. All you've got to do is just speak it. I say this man here, this centurion, has some outstanding qualities about him. Not only was he sympathetic and caring for his servant, not only was he respectful of what it was to have authority and how to use it rather than abuse it, not only was he humble, but he had a tremendous faith in Christ, didn't he? He knew that Christ could do what he wanted them to do. And Jesus responded to that. In verse 10, said, Verily I say unto you, I have not found so great faith, no, not in Israel. And I take that to mean that even though Christ had not come to the Gentiles primarily at the first, he came primarily to his own brethren, the Jews, did he not? But he hadn't found anybody, even among the Jews, had any greater faith than what this Gentile was showing him. This Gentile evidently had heard a great deal about Christ, maybe had seen a great deal about Christ. Whatever the evidence had convinced him concerning these things about Christ, and Christ took note of it. And he commended him for these qualities that he was exhibiting here. And then Christ said, I say unto you, many shall come from the east and west, and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. But the children of the kingdom shall be cast out into outer darkness. There shall be weeping and gnashing of teeth. Now the children of the kingdom he's talking about here, those are the kingdom of Israel. Those are the kingdom of Israel, you know. He came to his own, but his own received him not. They turned against him. It was the Gentile people that accepted Christ. After the initial establishment of the church on Pentecost, which of course consisted entirely of Jews, why, it was Gentiles that primarily accepted Christ rather than the Jews. And Jesus is saying here, people will come from all over, and they'll be with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And of course, that was the great ambition of all the Jewish people. They just looked up to Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. They were just almost gods to them. They were certainly their forebearers. They were so important to them. And to be in their presence was to be admired and something to be desired. But he said their people will come from every direction. And they'll be among Abraham and Isaac and Jacob. And Jesus said to the centurion, verse 13, "Go thy way, as thou hast believed, so be it done unto thee." And his servant was healed in the self-same hour. Well, I gather from this, don't you, that Jesus did not go to the house of the centurion? That he did what the centurion thought he had the power to do, just simply speak the word. And the power would be executed and the man would be healed. And that's what happened. And Jesus said that it was because this man had such faith and confidence in him. Now, who was this centurion? Well, as far as we know, we don't know exactly who he was. His name is not given. I think it's interesting, of all these centurions, there are only 2 of them in the Bible that their name is given. The rest of them, they're not even considered important enough to even give their name. But he certainly played, I think, a very important role in establishing before the people in that area the deity of Jesus Christ. He played an important role in showing that Christ was who he claimed to be, and that he had this power. And after all, that's one of the things that he came to accomplish, that the people would receive him as the Son of God and as to be the Savior of all mankind. I think this centurion, though he had some very outstanding qualities, he's a minor character of the Bible, but a very important one was he. I think he was. Anyone have any comment you would like to make about this good man? I don't see any fault in him. Well, the next time we read about a centurion is way over after the termination of the earthly ministry of Christ, all the way to Matthew chapter 27. Matthew 27, beginning with verse 50. In verse 50, Christ is on the cross. And Jesus, when he had cried again with a loud voice, yielded up the ghost. In other words, he died. And behold, the veil of the temple was rent in twain from the top to the bottom, and the earth did quake, and the rocks rent, and the graves were opened, and many bodies of the saints which slept arose, and came out of the graves after his resurrection, and went into the holy city, and appeared unto many. I want to make a few side comments here about this episode here. It says that the graves were opened. I don't think the graves were opened at the time that Christ died. It says it was after his resurrection. That must have been an awesome thing for those people to witness, that Christ had died and he had risen from the dead. And of course, many of them denied the resurrection. But here were people that had died, and they were resurrected at the time that Christ was resurrected. Now, they died again. He was the first one to be resurrected, never to die again. And these resurrected people, they appeared to a lot of folks. Must have been very convincing to those people, it would seem to me, that the resurrection was a reality. It was not just some myth, not just some dream, not just some wish. Here's something that was true. And you'll notice at the death of Christ, several physical things that took place. The veil of the temple was rent, torn in two. This, I think, is very significant, because that veil was between the holy place and the most holy place with the occupancy of God. And when that veil was rent, why, that ended that situation, didn't it? That ended the distinction of the holy place and the most holy place in the temple. And it was rent from top to bottom. Now, it might not have been too much to have started tearing it from the bottom and rip it up to the top. But the top to the bottom, that was an unusual tear. That's not the things we'd usually tear. And there was an earthquake, and rocks were rent. Now, there was something here that attracted the attention of the man that we have in mind. In verse 54, that's the centurion. I don't think he saw the veil being torn. He didn't. The resurrection of these people came later on. But when the centurion and they that were with him saw the earthquake, now that attracted their attention. Here was something very significant at the death of this one on the cross, and those things that were done, they feared greatly, saying, truly, this was the Son of God. Now, there was a physical manifestation there of evidence that convinced this man that the one they had crucified was a very special one. I dare say that this centurion, this was not the first time that he had been an instrument in executing people at the cross. In fact, that was part of the work of the centurions and the soldiers. The Jews, of course, could condemn a person to death, but were not allowed by the Romans to execute them, to carry it out. They had to get the Romans to carry it out, and the Romans actually carried it out. And here was the evidence that this was not just an ordinary criminal that he had no doubt experienced in the execution of many times before. Here was one that he was convinced truly this was the Son of God. And who does not but know that this confession of this centurion has rung down through the ages to his admiration and to the glorification of Jesus Christ. Small man, big words, significant truth that he proclaims here, and he contributed to the exaltation of my Savior and yours. That must have been an awesome moment and a very impressionable man. Now I want us to turn to some centurions that dealt with the life of the Apostle Paul. You will recall that the Apostle Paul, at the end of his third missionary journey, he came to Jerusalem. He wanted to be there at the time of the Pentecost celebration. A lot of Jews would be there. He would have the opportunity to preach to them. But when he came to Jerusalem, he was really risking his life, because it had been said that among them that you're teaching against the law of Moses, you're teaching people not to circumcise their sons and so forth. He wasn't doing any of that. He didn't teach against the law of Moses. He taught the right place of the law of Moses, that it was a schoolmaster to bring them unto Christ. He didn't teach people not to circumcise. He simply said it doesn't make any difference. It doesn't have anything to do with your relationship to God anymore. Now, it did under Abraham, and it did under the law of Moses. But he taught that that was no longer binding upon the Jews and upon anybody. Never was binding upon the Gentiles. But he knew he would face hostility when he came to Jerusalem. And he really faced hostility. So much so that the apostles tried to make arrangements whereby they might pacify the crowd and not be so hard on the Apostle Paul. Well, the Apostle Paul was seen in the city in verse 29 of Acts 21 with a man named Trophimus. Now, Trophimus was from the city of Ephesus. He was a Gentile. And I noticed what it says about these people, whom they supposed that Paul had brought into the temple. They had jumped to a conclusion here. It was a false conclusion. They were wrong about it. You know, that's the only exercise some people get, is jumping to the wrong conclusions. That's the biggest jump they make in life. But anyway, they supposed he had brought that Gentile into the temple. Of course, that would aggravate the Jews if he had done a thing like that. He hadn't done a thing like that. He didn't take Trophimus into the temple, but they were so angry about him, and verse 31 says they went about to kill him. Now that's how hostile they were toward the Apostle Paul. And they were about to kill him until the chief captain heard about what was going on, and he went down to rescue him. And it says, wait a minute, I want to be sure I get the right verse. Verse 32, who immediately took soldiers and centurions and ran down unto them, and when they saw the chief captain and soldiers, they left beating of Paul. I don't know who these centurions were. They were under the command of this captain, and they went down there and they rescued Paul from being killed. How important were those men? I think sparing of the life of the Apostle Paul was a pretty significant thing, don't you? You consider all the work that he does even after this, and all the epistles and so forth that he wrote even after this. What they did, though they no doubt did not realize the magnitude of the effect of what they were doing, what they contributed here was really significant. And they rescued Paul, and when they came down there, the people left off from beating them. Well, they weren't through, however. Paul, when he was seized, he asked to speak to the people, and he did. Verse 40 says he spoke to them in the Hebrew tongue. Well, what he spoke was a rehearsal of his conversion. He told how he had gone to Damascus, the purpose that he went, about how he was converted, how he saw the Lord asking him, why persecutest thou me? And so he told how that the Lord would send him, verse 21 of chapter 22, would send thee far hence unto the Gentiles. You talk about throwing gasoline on a spark, that did it. These Jews so despised the Gentiles, the very mentioning of Gentiles threw them into a rage, and they again sought to destroy Paul. And the chief captain saw that there was a problem, and so he said, let's take this man to the castle, that's their headquarters, and I think examine him by scourging. Can you imagine being examined by being scourged? Is that a good way to examine people? To beat them with the cords of scourging? And that he was going to find out what all of this was about. And when he was getting ready to do that, somebody stopped him. Who was it that stopped him? Verse 26. Paul said, is it lawful for you to scourge a Roman that's uncondemned? And the centurion, when he heard that, he went to the captain, and he said in essence, and I'm paraphrasing here, whoa, you better stop what you are doing. You are going too far. This man's a Roman. Well, the chief captain comes in to him, he says, are you a Roman? He said, yes. And he said, well, I bought mine. How'd you get yours? He said, I was born Roman. I was born a citizen in the city of Tarsus. That was a Roman province. And he was a legitimate Roman, and he could not be scourged lawfully. And who was it that carried that message to the chief captain? That was the centurion. Now, you know, he didn't have to do that. It took a little bit of gall and nerve on his part to go to his superior and tell him, in essence, you're getting ready to make a big mistake. You're doing wrong. You don't have a right to do what you're about to carry out. This man's a Roman, and you know the law against that, about what you're getting ready to do. He must have been a very brave centurion. He could have, this captain could have told him, you better shut up and go and tend to your own business. I'll tend to this. But the centurion, he had a responsibility. And maybe he was the one that was supposed to administer the lashes, and he didn't want that on his back either. And so he stopped them from beating Paul. So what did these centurions do in these couple of chapters? They saved him from being killed by the mob. That's significant. They saved him from being scourged, and that was significant. And that's not all. The Apostle Paul then was asked to come before the council, and he makes his speech before the council, and the people heard it. You know, it was in this instance that the Apostle Paul exercised a great deal of wisdom. He looked out there at the council. He saw Pharisees, he saw Sadducees, and he sort of weighed, they're both my enemies. They both got it in for me. How am I going to get out of this situation? Well, Paul was pretty smart. He knew that the Sadducees denied the resurrection. He knew that they didn't believe in spirits. He knew the Pharisees believed in both. So what does he do? He divides and conquers. He said, I'm here because I'm a Pharisee. I believe in the resurrection. I believe it. Oh boy, that meant that those people, they tore into one another. And one of them said, we better leave him alone. You know, God may have spoken to him. And others began to defend him. And others said, no, let's go ahead and kill him. Well, they couldn't go ahead and do it. And so the chief captain had to rescue him again, because I don't know, if these soldiers hadn't have been there, I don't think Paul would have survived. They had to protect him all the way through, and they did. Well, there were 40 men that, in verse 13 of chapter 23, they made a conspiracy. They said, we're not going to eat nor drink till we kill him. I've often wondered about those 40 men, how hungry they got. Because they didn't kill him. I bet they broke their vow, don't you? I bet you they ate and they drank after a while. They said to the chief captain, now, to bring him down to the council again, get the chief captain to bring him down, and on the way, we'll fall upon him and we're going to assassinate him right here and now. And there was somebody, and we'll inject another person right here in the midst of all of this. There was another person that comes into this story, rather insignificant little lad, the nephew of the Apostle Paul. Some way or another, he found out about this conspiracy, how that they hoped to waylay Paul on his way to the council. And what does this lad do? Now, we don't know what his name was, but he was a very outstanding character in this episode. He goes into Paul and he tells Paul what's getting ready to take place. And who does Paul call? Paul calls a centurion. Says, take this man to your captain. He needs to tell him something, and the captain needs to know it. So the centurion again does his duty, and he performs remarkably. I think that it is remarkable about the centurions all the way through. I never read of anything negative about any of them, do you? There might be one little negative thing about Julius, one of them that's named later on when he didn't take Paul's advice, and we'll get to that, not today, but we'll get to that one maybe later on. But the centurions were generally always positive in the cause for which the apostles were working. They always were lawful and law enforcers. And so this centurion took Paul's nephew to the chief captain, and who does the chief captain summon? In verse 23 of chapter 23, he called unto him 2 centurions, 200 soldiers, horsemen 70, spearsmen 200, and he said, and you make a beast, provide a beast for Paul to ride on, and you take him to Caesarea, and you take him to Felix. He has an army to escort him. The chief captain was not going to let anything happen to the Apostle Paul. I get a little amused at the chief captain. He sends a letter to Felix. He says, now let me tell you about this fella. He comes in, and I found out that he was a Roman, and they were getting ready to do things bad to him, and I saved him. Why, that's a lie. He didn't save him because he was a Roman. He was told that he was a Roman. He was getting ready to whip him regardless of what he was. But the chief captain, he was a real politician. He was putting the butter on pretty thick, so just for his own. But anyway, he sends all of these men, these armed men, these soldiers and all, to take Paul to Felix. And of course, Felix was the Roman authority in that territory at that time. Now, we see the centurions have some more to do with the Apostle Paul, and we're going to see about him next week. You know, as I said, there are only 2 of these centurions in the Bible that are named. One of them is a man named Julius. He plays an important role with the Apostle Paul. And I suppose the most famous centurion of the New Testament is Cornelius. And Cornelius, I would rather think Cornelius was a rather prominent and outstanding individual, because he was the first Gentile, as far as we can tell, to whom the gospel was preached by the Apostle Peter. Now, the gospel had been preached to the Jews and to the Samaritans, but when it comes to Cornelius, he is named. Well, we'll discontinue our study at this point, and Lord willing, we'll resume next week on some of these centurions, and next week we'll wind up about all these little people and little things, and hope we'll all consider ourselves not too little, because what we do really matters.